Ever stop to think about how the words we use, or maybe the words we don't use, can really change how we see things, especially when it comes to, power and policy?
Absolutely. It's fascinating.
Sometimes it feels like the less clear the language, the more hidden meaning there might be,
Yeah.
potentially something quite insidious.
hmm That ambiguity can do a lot of work.
So today we're doing a deep dive into some really provocative ideas from an article by Larken Rose called "The Vagueness That Fuels State Violence."
Yeah, I read that. It's quite a piece.
It really is. Rose offers this powerful, sometimes quite uncomfortable critique of how governments' systems of authority, how they use language.
He definitely doesn't pull any punches.
Right. So our mission here is to really unpack his core argument. He basically says vague language isn't just like sloppy talk.
No, he sees it as deliberate.
Exactly. A deliberate tool. Designed, he argues, to hide actions that, if we saw them clearly, would probably find morally repugnant.
Yeah. Barbaric, even, is a term he might use.
We're going to explore the examples he gives, which are often quite stark, maybe even surprising.
And it is fascinating, isn't it, how language, something we use every single day, can be, well, weaponized like that at such a fundamental level.
It really connects to that broader idea of critical thinking, doesn't it? Questioning the information we get.
Definitely. Especially information from powerful sources.
So Rose kicks off with this really strong assertion about this manipulation. Can you walk us through how he sees governments using vague political military language, how it's a tool to obscure things like mass violence, war, authoritarian enforcement?
Yeah, so his core insight, I think, is that it's not just about hiding facts. It's about exploiting our own psychology.
Ah, so?
By keeping terms really fuzzy.
Mhm.
The bad guys, terrorists, illegal immigrants, the state kind of outsources the moral judgment.
Okay.
We fill in the blanks with our own ideas, our own fears maybe,
Mm.
and in that space, our critical thinking can just sort of stall.
Ah, I see. So the vagueness allows actions to go forward that wouldn't if they were clearly defined.
Precisely. He argues that if these actions were described literally, step by step, most people would be horrified. They'd see them as, well, barbaric.
It's kind of chilling when you put it like that, the power of abstraction. Does he give concrete examples of this, how governments might phrase things?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He points out they rarely say, we're going to drop a bomb on this specific apartment building, and we know these civilians are inside.
Right. You never hear that.
Instead, it's always framed as targeting threats, or neutralizing targets, or defending freedom. Very abstract.
Which creates this massive disconnect, then, between the policy decision and the actual human consequences.
Exactly, a huge gap. And he also touches on how actions are framed nationally. The U.S. did this or Israel did that, when in reality,
It's a small group making decisions.
right, a handful of people in power decide, but it's often innocent people, completely uninvolved, who suffer the consequences. That national framing obscures the individual responsibility and the individual suffering.
He has that really striking analogy, too, doesn't he? To highlight the double standard.
The firebombing one?
Yeah. He says something like, if your neighbor said there are criminals across town, so I'm going to firebomb the whole area, we'd call him a maniac.
Right. Instantly.
But when a government does something analogous, it gets labeled defense or national security.
And that really does crystallize the whole point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The way framing changes everything.
It really does. And he takes that idea of changing perspective even further with a thought experiment. He asks you, the listener, to imagine being an invincible observer.
Right, someone who could see everything.
Yeah, someone who could literally see every single person who would be harmed, say, by a bomb or a specific policy before it happens, and then decide if it should go ahead.
What's the power of that hypothetical, according to Rose? Why does he think it's so revealing?
Well, he argues it exposes something fundamental about us, a kind of innate aversion we have to witnessing direct personal violence.
Okay.
His point is, if people could truly see the actual lives being destroyed, the faces, the families, they would almost certainly say, stop. They'd reject the military action or the policy.
So it forces a confrontation with the real consequences.
Exactly. And it raises that uncomfortable question. How much does our physical and emotional distance allow us to tolerate things we otherwise wouldn't? How much does that linguistic vagueness enable that distance?
That's a powerful question. Makes you think about what we consent to,
Yeah.
perhaps unknowingly, just by accepting the abstract language.
And he doesn't just keep it theoretical. He applies this critique very directly, for instance, to U.S. immigration enforcement.
Yeah, he does.
How does he use that example to show the gap between, say, the public narrative around something like ICE raids and the reality he describes?
Well, he points out how these operations, often involving masked agents, deportations, they're presented to the public as necessary actions against dangerous illegals or, criminals.
That's the common framing, yeah.
But Rose argues the reality is often very different. He says these actions frequently end up targeting people who are just peaceful, trying to make a living. Maybe they lack the right paperwork, but they're not dangerous.
Does he give a specific kind of scenario?
Yeah, he paints a picture of like a kind, well-liked local woman, maybe someone running a food stall, someone integrated into the community, suddenly being seized and deported simply for lacking documentation.
And his point is that that specific reality is often not what people think they're supporting.
Exactly. It's not the image conjured up by the vague term cracking down on illegal immigration. People might support the abstract idea, but not that specific action against that specific person.
He uses another sharp metaphor for that too, right? Something about buying a product.
Oh yeah, he says, it's like buying a product advertised to solve crime and finding out it kidnaps your neighbor.
Wow, that's blunt.
It is. It's meant to shock you into seeing the disconnect.
Now, it's important to note, Rose applies this lens pretty impartially. He doesn't just focus on one side of the political spectrum. He also turns his critique towards arguments often associated more with the left, specifically around gun control.
That's right. He does.
How does he argue that even policies aimed at reducing violence can, through this mechanism of vagueness, end up fueling state violence?
Well, his argument, as I understand it, is that some gun control policies, even if the intent is to reduce violence, can end up empowering state agencies. He mentions the ATF, specifically to conduct violent raids.
Against who, though?
Against citizens who might be peaceful, otherwise law-abiding, but have maybe violated some gun law that he describes as obscure or arbitrary.
So not necessarily violent criminals.
Right. He's challenging the assumption that these laws only impact dangerous people. He suggests they can create situations where the state uses force against individuals over technicalities.
And he uses some pretty heavy historical examples to back this up, doesn't he? Waco and Ruby Ridge.
Yes, exactly. He brings up the Waco siege, that terrible 51-day standoff with dozens dead.
A real tragedy.
And then Ruby Ridge, another deadly standoff. And Rose specifically highlights that in the Ruby Ridge case, the initial issue, according to him, was a technical violation about the length of a shotgun barrel.
A technicality leading to that.
That's his point. He argues that this technical detail, something an average person might not even be aware of, became the justification for an escalating federal response that ultimately led to deaths.
So he uses these extreme cases to illustrate how regulations, when enforced by the state with its monopoly on force, can allegedly go far beyond addressing actual violent crime and instead target individuals over paperwork or specifications.
Precisely. It's part of his broader critique of state power being used in ways that harm peaceful people, often hidden behind the justification of law enforcement or regulation.
Okay, so given all this criticism of existing systems and the way language is used, Rose doesn't just leave it there. He proposes an alternative framework, doesn't he? Something called voluntaryism.
Yes. Or ethical anarchism, as he sometimes calls it.
What's the core idea behind voluntaryism as he lays it out?
It's actually, in principle, very simple. He argues that all human interactions should be voluntary. Consent is key.
All interactions.
All of them. And flowing from that, he has a very strict rule about the use of force.
Okay, what's the rule?
Force is only justified, in his view, in one specific circumstance, to stop an actual aggressor. Someone actively initiating violence or violating rights, self-defense or defense of others against aggression. That's it.
So anything beyond that immediate defensive use of force is illegitimate.
According to Rose's framework, yes. Any system, government, military, police that uses force beyond stopping active aggressors is inherently immoral.
Wow. That's a fundamental challenge to how most societies are structured.
It absolutely is. It's a radical critique of the legitimacy of the state itself, arguing that much of what governments do constitutes aggression, not defense, under his definition.
So if we try to sort of pull together the main threads from Rose's article, what are the key themes that really stand out?
Well, first and foremost, it's that idea of vagueness as a deliberate tool. Not accidental, but intentional, used for control.
Right. And closely linked to that is
Dehumanization through abstract language. Calling people targets or illegals makes it easier to enact violence against them.
Which hides the...
The systemic violence hidden behind euphemisms, collateral damage, enhanced interrogation, things like that.
Okay. And then the alternative he proposes.
The moral clarity, he believes, comes from voluntaryism, that simple principle of non-aggression.
And underlying all of it seems to be this call for what? A fundamental shift in thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a call to evolve beyond what he sees as an uncritical belief in authority, to stop taking government pronouncements at face value.
So he's really urging people to. What's the final call to action?
It's essentially, wake up. Look past the labels, past the justifications. Look at the real-world results of policies and actions on actual human beings.
And to choose voluntary, peaceful interaction instead of coercive systems.
That seems to be the core message, yes.
He ends with a quote that really sticks with you, doesn't it? About voters.
Oh, yeah. It's powerful. He says, if voters could see exactly what their vote does to real people up close, they'd be horrified.
That really lands, doesn't it? It forces you to connect abstract political support with concrete human outcomes.
Definitely.
Well, this deep dive into Larken Rose's article, it's certainly given us, and hopefully you, a challenging lens, a really crucial way to think differently about language, power, and the state.
It definitely pushes you to question assumptions.
Absolutely. It forces you to scrutinize the words used, especially by those in authority.
And maybe that's the perfect final thought to leave listeners with. Consider just how deeply embedded this kind of abstract language is in our everyday public conversations. And maybe ask yourself, how can you start to push back against that vagueness? In your own thinking, in the news you consume, always trying to look for that concrete human impact hidden behind the broad, impersonal terms.
A vital question. Looking for the person behind the policy.